Well, as we've talked about several times on the show, M103, the anti-Islamophobia motion passed by Parliament earlier this year, it is now being studied by Canada's Heritage Committee, led by none other than Liberal MP Hetty Fry. I just keep mentioning that because I think of all the MPs, there's 338 of them, to choose the MP who falsely stood up in Parliament 15, 16 years ago and said that there were crosses burning in Prince George as we speak. So the originator of fake news and fake accusations of racism is in charge of this. That's a bad sign. But a worse sign were some of the witnesses that came forward. We spoke to Eric Duhem yesterday about Michelle Junot Katsuya, a former CSIS agent, who called for people who criticize Islam to be prosecuted and radio stations to have their licenses taken away. If you thought that's bad, it gets worse. The CBC has now deployed its substantial resources to the promotion of anti-Islamophobia propaganda and to telling Canadians, well, look at this story. Sharia and rules that govern religious practices in other faiths are not to be feared. Spiritual leaders say, and I'll read the next line, Motion M103 sparked petitions, free speech concerns, and fears it would lead to Sharia law in Canada. But here is the CBC with a lengthy article saying, no, it's not to be feared, even though they only interview people on one side of the story. Joining us now via Skype is our friend Candice Malcolm, who has replied to this CBC article in today's column she has in the Toronto Sun chain of newspapers and online. Great to see you again, Candice.
Great to be here, Ezra, and thank you for picking up this important story and really letting us examine it more, because it's really bizarre what the CBC has written and the whole underlying idea here of normalizing Sharia law.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that the CBC, the state broadcaster, would write an extended essay called Nothing to Fear. Well, that's a political judgment that ordinary Canadians can make themselves. They don't need to be told by the state broadcaster in advance before M103 is given its flesh and bones. There's nothing to worry about. But you point out in your article in the Sun that they only interviewed one side of the story, didn't they?
Right. So the story includes quotes from a Liberal MP who is, of course, promoting the Liberal motion M103, as well as a couple of spiritual leaders who all have the same opinion, Ezra. They all say, well, Sharia law, first of all, they say Sharia law is already in Canada because they conflate the personal spiritual guidance that Islam provides to people of the Muslim faith with the political laws that govern Islamic societies known as Sharia. So they say Sharia is already in Canada, and because it's only affecting Muslims, it isn't to be feared by the broader Canadian society. So, the piece itself had several very problematic elements to it. And of course, part of it is just no balance. You kind of expect the CBC to slant to the left a little bit. They always have. But they could at least include a skeptical voice about M103, or someone saying, Sharia in practice in all of these Islamic countries is pretty unfair, pretty illiberal, and it doesn't have anything in common really with Canadian law. It undermines Canadian law. Yeah. Instead, we just had basically a glowing puff piece talking about how Sharia is just, it's basically just normalizing it. And I think that's problematic. I think it's also problematic that I wrote a piece critical of the CBC piece, and the reaction has been very negative against me, of course, by the mainstream media and the left-wing brigade of people who are offended and calling racism and bigotry to anyone who talks about these issues.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to name particular names because some of them actually work for the same company you do, and I'm just delighted that you and Anthony Furey and maybe one or two others, I can count them on one hand's fingers, are ringing the alarm about M103, and I'm so glad you have the larger megaphone of the Toronto Sun at your disposal. But there are other people, even within your own company, that are publicly denouncing you for this, which is funny. I mean, put aside Postmedia and private journalists, you would think the state broadcaster might have some sort of mandate to have both sides of the story. And Tarek Fatah, who's been on our show many times, he testified quite forcefully against M103 in Parliament. I'm glad he was there. He made the excellent point that shouldn't he as a Muslim be allowed to criticize his own faith? Who is the Canadian government to tell him not? But we know that his daughter, Natasha Fatah, works for the CBC and seems to, at least on Twitter, share her father's skepticism about M103. So we know even within the bosom of the CBC, there are people who at least know there's another side of the story. We have wonderful liberal-oriented Canadian patriotic Muslim activists, Raheel Raza, Salim Mansour, just to name a couple on the top of my head, who could give the other side of the story. Why is the CBC not giving them any airtime?
Well, first of all, I'm glad that people like Natasha Fatah are inside the CBC so that they can remind people in the newsroom and their colleagues that there is another side to the story. Part of my concern with the original CBC piece was that there was a quote saying that anyone who opposes M103, anyone who opposes Sharia law, it boils down to bigotry, plain and simple. Right. Well, that, of course, isn't true, Ezra. And one of the things that I mentioned in my Sun column is that back in 2003, 2004, when an Islamic organization tried to propose Sharia courts in Canada. They wanted to have tribunals and basically a parallel legal system that governed the lives of Muslims in Ontario. It was Muslim activists. It was liberal Muslim activists, progressives that stood up, people like Tariq Fatah, and said, no, we don't want Islamic law in Canada. Part of the reason that we fled other countries is because we didn't like that style of governance. We wanted freedom. We wanted freedom of religion, freedom from religion. And that's, part of the appeal of Canada. I have plenty of Muslim immigrants and refugees in my life that I know, they fled that. They don't want Iranian Islamic law. They don't want Saudi Islamic law in Canada. They don't want anything remotely close to that. So when something like that starts creeping up, it's usually a faction of people from that society that are trying to impose those rules here in Canada. And often, Ezra, it is the Muslim voices who are speaking out loudest against it. And who are we to say that they shouldn't be able to have their voice? They've lived under this tyrannical set of laws that really have no place in Canada. So I'm pleased that people like Tariq Fatah are on my side on this one, with all of the pro-clutching from the liberal media. It's Tariq Fatah that's defending me and others. We should be able to criticize Sharia law. We should be able to say, no, that's not something that is that coincides with life in Canada. It's incompatible, frankly. And we shouldn't be bullied by liberal journalists and leftist journalists trying to silence this side of the discussion.
Yeah. Let me ask you one more question. When Juno Katsoya said outlandish things about banning people, prosecuting people, taking away radio licenses, it was quite something for an ex-RCMP officer to daydream in Technicolor about living really in an authoritarian state. I'm not sure how connected he is to CSIS anymore. He's been in the private sector a very long time. But the fact that he was invited by the Liberals and given softball questions by the Liberals to set him up shows that at least he's part of their extended intellectual family. And what do you think the reason is that the Liberals want to bring someone so extreme? Do you think it's just to scare people? I was talking to Eric Duhem yesterday, and he said that maybe some of this is just to scare journalists away from speaking critically if they're worried that they'll be prosecuted now. Another theory is less tricky. It's just, no, this is really the direction where the Liberals are going. They really are bringing people who believe in authoritarian censorship, at least on this one subject of Islam, and that this is no trick. They're trying to lay down the intellectual and expert basis for restricting freedom of speech, especially the freedom to criticize Islam. What do you think the Liberal game plan was to bring in such an extreme radical censor like that? What do you think the plan was?
Well, it is a charade, plain and simple. I think typically when you do these kind of political, it's like a show trial, Ezra. It really is. Maybe if you bring in someone more extreme, it moves the Overton window, so to speak, over so that you can, go up the middle and not seem as extreme as some of the people on the far left suggesting very authoritarian things. I mean, it's even if they don't go anywhere near as far as the recommendations, the fact that an expert was in our parliament in Canada recommending the most authoritarian Sharia law-like rules is something that should be of concern to all Canadians. I hope it backfires. I hope that enough Canadians catch on and see the kinds of suggestions that are being proposed at this ridiculous testimony. Remember, when folks like myself, like you, were first concerned over M103, a lot of journalists in the mainstream media were saying, "Oh, don't worry, it's just emotion. You know, it's intellectually dishonest to say it's legislation because it's just emotion." Well, here we are having experts testify, and remember, they're putting together a report to come up with a whole of government approach. It's a quote from the original motion. So, you know, this is more than just emotion. This is now taking steps into public policy, and I think that hopefully the Liberals have overplayed their card, and Canadians will, you know, speak up against this and remind their MPs that, you know, in a free society, the government doesn't get to shut down radio stations. It doesn't get to prosecute people for incorrect or wrong tweets. And I hope that that's what happens. But as far as the rationale for the Liberals, you know, I think that this is probably what they think, what they believe, and at least, you know, part of the thinking within the government is that, you know, they want extra powers to crack down on people who they don't agree with.
Yeah, that's terrifying. I think you're right. I think we have to take them at face value. They actually do want to go with these, through with these plans. Candice Malcolm, great to see you. Thanks for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to hear from you.
All right, thanks for having me.
All right. Well, we'll certainly keep an eye on M103. I see a room here for another rally on this subject. As you may recall, we put together a rally on short notice in January, and we had about 1,000 people turn up for it. And I think things are going to get worse. There may be room for a legal challenge as well. We'll have to see what the government proposes, but I know one or two free speech lawyers that might get involved. That's an excerpt from my daily TV show, The Ezra Levant Show. Normally it's behind a paywall, but I thought you'd like this video, so we put it on YouTube. If you want to subscribe to watch the daily show every day, including always 2 interviews a day, and I read my hate mail, just click on this screen and become a premium member.